Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I want to walk you through my gouache and colored pencil process for this fairy portrait. Today I'm going to be using Holbein and Windsor Newton gouache and my Strathmore mixed media sketchbook. I'm starting out with some dried gouache and I will also use some tube gouache, but I'm using dried gouache in the beginning because I like to work thin gouache to thick gouache, and I already have my palette prepared with the dried gouache. I have all of my colors set up in this rectangular palette, and it is easier for me to get a thinner texture for these initial underpainting layers. When I'm using dried gouache, I tend to go in too thick if I start with wet gouache immediately. So my first step is just to kind of underpaint and get rid of the white of the paper, just kind of cover everything with a base color, and then I am going to start outlining the features with a warm sort of warm red color. It's my flesh tone color mixed with the warm red in my palette. I don't really plan to keep the firm outline around all of the features, but since I'm using gouache, it really helps to do that in these early layers, and then they kind of fade into the later layers and soften up quite a bit, so it won't really be a firm line, but the lines will kind of soften and blend in a little bit more in the later stages. So now I'm just kind of giving some shape to the lips and just at this stage setting base colors for all of the different features, and then sort of going in and defining the forms from my sketch in paint and beginning to sort of differentiate the values, kind of putting down darker values where there are darker values, even though it has more building of the values to be done, sort of just getting started with this at this point. My painting process, I feel like it's a little slow. I don't know, I feel like it takes me a long time to build up in a painting. Everything is such a gradual process, so I like to just kind of slowly do sort of like a give and take of like defining forms and values, and if I go too much in one direction, I can kind of take it away. And at this point, I'm using gouache more almost like watercolors. They're really watered down, not even completely opaque, and then I'm trying to reserve the white of the paper or lighter values in areas that have it. So now I'm kind of just giving that darker value to this side of the face and more defining the form of the face. I actually really like the painting at this stage. This is right before the painting hits its ugly stage, I think. For me, especially with gouache, every painting has a really ugly stage where you get a little bit discouraged, and I think when I added this dark shadow is when that happened for me. For this shadow, I added some indigo blue to the, I think, flame red that I was using with the skin tone to make sort of a purple, and then I mixed it with the pale rose blush that was my base skin tone, and that made a darker shadow color, and I wanted to carry that shadow over actually farther than you will see it in the finished painting, because I wanted any spaces in the hair that I will do later to show through as that shadowed flesh tone. So I think at this point, this is definitely the ugly stage. It gives the face like a little bit of a strange looking shape, but it will be revised later. And then I am just sort of laying in the base tone for the eyes. When I first started, I did not know for sure what color scheme I wanted to go with, and I decided that she was going to be very pink and purple because I like to work with those colors. So yeah, she has purple eyes and then this pink and purple background and then later purple hair, and I really like those color choices. As you can see here in my gouache palette, those are some of my favorite gouache colors. Now I'm laying in more details with the gouache. Before I switched to colored pencils, I decided I wanted to make the background a little bit warmer, so I'm kind of doing a little bit of a gradient of the opera pink and the lilac to give it a little bit more variation and texture. And I'm using both of those colors in her face too, so it kind of ties it together, and in her hair as well. But I wanted the background to be kind of a light, washed out version of those colors, so she'll still stand out against it. My process for using gouache as a base layer, as I'm doing here, is to define everything as much as I can in the gouache, especially the color temperature and the form, as well as the light and dark values. I want to go ahead and give her face the shape that it'll have, and really go ahead and define everything, but leave room to finish it with the colored pencils as far as doing the more detailed and then also some more highlights and dark values. But I want to lay everything down and get started with the gouache, but still leave space to kind of add more detail and more light and dark values in specific areas, and I feel like the colored pencil gives you a little bit more control for that, and also it kind of lets you correct any values with the gouache that you maybe want to bring in a different direction slightly. The way I am using gouache and colored pencils together is that I am making the foundation of everything gouache. I'm laying down pretty much everything, and at the point where I switched to colored pencils, I really could have finished it in gouache and made it a full-on gouache painting, but I like to do the finer details with colored pencils, and I also like to use colored pencils to add a little bit more texture. I find that especially for skin, the texture of blending colored pencils on paper over the smooth background that's already there, the smooth foundation of the gouache, gives a really kind of a more realistic skin color. I'm using the Prismacolor Premier colored pencils and a lot of different warm colors mostly. I actually put down a lot more colors that I thought I might use that I didn't end up use. I mostly end up using the neon pink, which is my favorite, and some of these flesh tones and the purple tones. And what I'm doing is I am doing really light layers, probably 3 or 4 layers in most areas, especially in the shadowed areas and the blush areas, but also a lot on her lips and nose. And I am defining the forms more with the colored pencils, and also adding some more depth of color. So I don't think there's anywhere where I just do 1 layer of colored pencils, but I'm going down very lightly and trying to use the pencils very sharp. So I'm using lots of tiny little circles of these colored pencils, and I don't push hard at this point. I'm going really lightly over the painting in these tiny little circles in the areas that I want. And then probably after like the 3rd or 4th layer, I will push a little bit harder to blend, but I'm not covering the whole thing, especially the lighter spaces on her face, like the higher parts of the cheek and the nose and the chin. I'm not using much as far as colored pencils, so I want to kind of let the colored pencils fade out smoothly into that lighter value of her face. So here I'm just using just very light circles of blush for her cheeks, and kind of putting makeup on her in a way, like I'm doing lip liner, and just kind of defining these really fine little details that are really, for me, a little bit more comfortable to do with pencils. And then as far as her hair, I'm adding highlights with the white colored pencils, and then also I did some of the like highlights of pink and lowlights of blue sort of hidden in her hair. And whenever I do hair with colored pencils, you always follow the direction of the strands of the hair, kind of go the direction of the hair and then blend in that same direction as well so that it flows. And just think about where you want your light and dark values and your warm and cool tones. I think especially with portraiture, understanding where the color temperature at different areas of the face really helps bring a portrait together. I have the book Color and Light by James Gurney, and there are some really great, there's actually I think a diagram of color temperature on different zones of the face in that book, and it is really, really insightful. And I think since I read that, I've always implemented that in my portraits. And so now I'm just kind of defining more, kind of bringing some of the lighter values a little bit lighter, and also blending out the edges of the shadow areas with the colored pencil. With colored pencils, especially in shadow areas, I feel like if you lay down, I usually use purple for shadows on skin. So if you lay down purple for a shadow to blend it and have it kind of come out smooth, you're going to need to just do it so lightly, and then also layer some other lighter tones. Like I'll do like a light layer of purple, and then a layer of the pink, and then like a layer of the darker flesh tone, and then kind of blend it out with a layer of the lighter flesh tone, like the shadows on her neck. And then I feel like if you don't do enough layers and then you blend it too soon, it will come out very, very splotchy. So it's something I'm careful about. So now I'm adding like the fine kind of individual hairs at the edge, and also some shadows of her ears. I kind of struggled with her ears because I didn't have, I mean, you're inventing elf ears or fairy ears when you draw them, and I should have looked up maybe a better reference of fairy ears to study, but I did not. I made them up. And so I think next time I draw fairy ears, I will look up a reference instead of thinking that I can just invent perfectly good fairy ears. But I think all in all, it turned out okay. I kept kind of adjusting them a little bit. I decided like she has a lot of warm like red tones in her face, and that her ears would also be pretty rosy. So I decided to make them a pretty warm color. And then towards the end, I usually try to wait to add a lot of white until the end, but so at this point I decided to add like white to the top of her nose, corners of her eyes, highlights on her lips. And that's always such a satisfying part of a colored pencil drawing, or really any drawing, is adding those like white highlights at the very end. Sometimes I think it's really hard to decide when I'm done working on a piece, especially one that I'm really enjoying working on. Like I just want the process to last forever, but I also want to finish it, of course. So this is kind of one of those times where I kept thinking, oh, I could add a little more. I could smooth this out a little more here, or add a little bit more blush here. But ultimately, you have to decide at some point when you're finished and when you're happy with it, so it doesn't get overworked. So I just decided to go in and add a few final touches and just kind of accentuate some highlights and shadows, and then add a little bit more blush to the ears and cheeks and nose, and a couple of little pops of like the pink color here and there. And then I decided I was done. I really enjoyed the process of creating this painting and of sharing it with you. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe to my channel. I would love to share more of my art journey with you.